Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before the code blue that would unravel everything he'd built. Laura Bennett moves through Seattle General in San Diego with the controlled precision of someone who has learned to disappear into institutional corridors, her civilian scrubs concealing 18 years as a Master Chief Petty Officer and 2 tours in Ramadi where she'd earned commendations she could never display. The fluorescent lights hum their constant electric prayer over antiseptic-scented hallways, and she navigates them the way a ghost navigates a house, present but invisible, efficient but unremarkable. Her hands move with the steady certainty of someone who has held dying men together under mortar fire, but her face shows nothing, a carefully maintained expression of professional neutrality that has become as comfortable as her own skin. Room for 47 sits at the end of the east corridor, its door propped open to allow nurses to monitor the cardiac patient inside. Laura pushes the rolling cart with its blood pressure cuff and clipboard toward the threshold, her white nursing shoes nearly silent against the tile floor. The patient's name on the chart reads Corporal James Morrison, IED blast victim from Ramadi, 8 weeks post-injury, traumatic brain injury classified as severe, prognosis for cognitive recovery guarded. She has read this chart 4 times, though she allowed herself only quick glances each time, terrified that staring too long might reveal something in her expression. Terrified that Morrison might somehow recognize her, despite what the neurologist's notes clearly stated: significant hippocampal damage, fragmented episodic memory, persistent gaps in personal recall spanning the entire 6-month period surrounding his injury. The paralysis came from spinal cord trauma, the doctors had explained in clinical language that stripped away the weight of what it meant, a 24-year-old man who would never walk again, who had lost months of his life to a fog he might never emerge from. She enters the room and begins her rounds with the same methodical approach she brings to everything: blood pressure first, 98/62, stable, written in the log. Temperature next, 97.4, normal, noted. She checks the foresight for signs of infection, the line running into his left arm clear and properly flushed. Routine work. Work that any nurse would do. But as she adjusts the bag of normal saline hanging from the metal stand, her eyes catch on something and her hands pause for exactly half a second, long enough for muscle memory to register the pause, long enough to know she noticed, not long enough for Morrison to detect it. On his right forearm, visible where his hospital gown has ridden up past his wrist, sits a tattoo rendered in black ink that has aged to grey-blue over years. A name. Her name. Laura Bennett. The letters are precise, military-style script, the kind of permanent mark a man makes when he swears never to forget. Except he has forgotten. He has lost her completely to the fog in his brain, and she stands in his room in civilian scrubs, one of a rotating cast of nurses whose names he likely does not retain. Her jaw tightens fractionally. Just that. No tremor in her hands. No falter in her breathing. She finishes adjusting the 4 and moves to check the cardiac monitor displaying his heart rhythm in green lines across the dark screen, sinus rhythm steady at 72 beats per minute, the electrical signals of his heart firing in perfect pattern. All good. Everything nominal. She makes a note in his chart in the standardized script of the medical profession, clinical and distant, and then she turns and walks back out into the corridor, her posture unchanged, her expression unchanged, a nurse who has just completed a routine check on a routine patient. The break room at 2:17 p.m. is blessedly empty, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a sickly institutional white. Laura moves to the lockers lining the wall, a row of narrow metal compartments that each nurse claims as territory. She opens number 47 with the combination she was given on her first day 6 months ago, and there, folded beneath her spare set of scrubs, sit the combat boots. The left one is marked with dust that came from a city that sits 6,000 miles away, dust from streets she navigated with tactical precision, dust from the moment she carried Corporal James Morrison toward the medevac helicopter with bullets tearing through the air around them like angry wasps, rounds pinging off the armored frame of the Humvee parked 200 meters back. The dust has never come off. She has never cleaned these boots. They sit in this locker like a shrine to something she is supposed to have stopped being. Her hands are steady as they reach out and touch the worn leather, running her fingers over the creases in the material that speak of 500 kilometers of patrol, the scuffs that mark each step taken in hostile territory. These boots carried her through the streets of Ramadi. These boots were on her feet when she saw Morrison's convoy take fire, when she ran toward the smoke instead of away from it, when her hands moved with the speed that comes from training taking over instinct. These boots stood in the medevac bird beside his stretcher as they lifted off into the sky, the rotor wash flattening everything below into submission. These boots walked her back to base that evening, and she has never worn them since, not once in 6 months, though she keeps them here in this locker, tucked beneath her civilian life like a secret that might detonate if anyone got too close. She hears footsteps approaching the break room and releases the boot immediately, her hand dropping away as though the leather has burned her. A resident enters, Dr. Hassan, internal medicine, perpetually tired eyes, and she nods to him without speaking, closing the locker door with a soft metallic click that sounds like a lock being turned. The resident pours coffee from the industrial brewer, black and bitter, and does not acknowledge her. She is just another nurse to him. Just staff. Just a woman in scrubs moving through the hospital like a shadow, indistinguishable from the others except perhaps for the slightly more precise way she moves, the way she seems to take up less space than other people, the way she speaks only when necessary and listens to every word anyone says. Dr. Caldwell enters at 2:31 p.m., his white coat trailing behind him like a cape, his presence altering the pressure in the room the way apex predators alter the pressure in water. He is tall in the manner of men who have always been told they are tall, who have structured their entire identity around physical dominance, and he moves through spaces as though he owns them by natural right. His hands are surgeon's hands, elegant and careful in their own domain, but his jaw carries the arrogance of someone who has been told he is the best at what he does so many times that the statement has become indistinguishable from fact. He glances at the resident pouring coffee, nods once with the brevity of a man acknowledging an inferior, and then his eyes land on Laura. They move across her with the casual dismissiveness of someone cataloguing furniture. Master's degree, he asks. The question is directed at her but phrased as though he is reading something written on her forehead. Bachelor's, Laura answers, her voice measured and even. Registered nurse, 8 years current. The lie sits in the space between them like something alive, but her expression does not shift. 8 years. He says it as though it is a number of minor significance, a detail beneath deeper consideration. Then you'll understand why experience sometimes trumps protocol. The post-op orders I wrote for Morrison in 447, they're based on 19 years of cardiac surgery. 19 years of outcomes that speak for themselves. The cardiac tamponade risk. Laura's words are quiet, almost provisional. The distended jugular veins. A higher monitoring frequency might catch. Might, Dr. Caldwell interrupts, his smile the smile of a man who has stopped thousands of sentences before completion. Is exactly the problem with someone who follows protocols instead of developing judgment. You know what you're doing because you've been trained to execute. I know what I'm doing because I understand why the training exists in the first place. He pours coffee into a mug that reads fastest gun in the West, a phrase he apparently considers both accurate and amusing. But I appreciate your concern. Shows initiative. Misguided, but present. The resident has become very focused on his coffee. Laura nods once, acknowledgement without agreement, and turns back toward the hallway. Dr. Caldwell's voice follows her, pitched just loudly enough that she will hear it but directed at the resident as though sharing an inside observation. Give them a little seniority and they think they can question the attending physician. I give you until week 2 before that one transfers to pediatrics where nobody questions anyone. He pauses, waiting for her to respond or retreat more fully. You'll see. She walks into the corridor without answering, her hands at her sides, her breathing unchanged, the humiliation sitting on her shoulders like a weight that most people would feel bending them downward. But her spine remains straight. Her pace does not alter. The trembling that some nurses experience in these moments, the tight throat, the burning eyes, the shame that writes itself into posture, none of that happens because she learned long ago to trap those responses in a locked compartment and leave them there. Shame is a luxury she gave up in Ramadi along with the ability to sleep through the night without hearing the sound of helicopter rotors. By 2:49 p.m., the lunch crowd has moved through the hospital cafeteria in its predictable wave, and Laura carries her tray, a salad with light dressing, a cup of chicken broth, a protein bar she had no intention of eating, toward an empty table near the window. The afternoon light falls across the plastic surface in geometric patterns that remind her of the grid squares on a tactical map. She sits down with her back to the wall, a habit from another life that she has never broken, and she is precisely halfway through her salad when the shadow falls across her tray. Dr. Caldwell stands above her, his tray held in both hands with the casual authority of a man who has never worried about dropping anything. His smile carries the quality of a performer about to deliver a punchline he has already told 100 times. You know what the average tenure is for nurses who decide protocol is more important than surgeon judgment. He does not wait for an answer. 6 days. Some make it to a week. I want to say 9 months, but we both know it won't be that. He leans down slightly, his voice dropping into the register that he apparently reserves for people he considers beneath serious address. I'm giving you 9 days before you realize this department doesn't have room for your particular type of enthusiasm. How's that sound? Laura meets his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to show she is not afraid, not long enough to be challenging, and then she returns her attention to her salad. The dismissal is complete and final. A lesser man might have escalated. Dr. Caldwell, unfortunately, is not a lesser man. He is the kind of man for whom being ignored by someone he considers beneath him is itself a form of insubordination. His hand moves with the casual velocity of someone operating in a space where consequences do not exist, the back of his hand connecting with the edge of her tray with the precise force required to send it airborne. The salad container tumbles through the air in slow motion, rotating on its axis, and the mixed greens scatter across the table and floor in a constellation of lettuce and croutons and dressing that patterns the white tile in an abstract design. The cafeteria sound drops to something close to silence. Not quite silent, spoons still clink against plates, refrigerator compressors still hum, the distant music playing through overhead speakers continues its background assault, but something fundamental has shifted in the room's acoustic properties. People have stopped pretending not to look. A medical chart someone had been reading falls to the floor, the papers fanning out, and Dr. Caldwell mutters something that may have been an apology or may have been commentary, his tone suggesting the latter. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he says, already walking away, and the words hang in the space he has left behind like a challenge posed. Laura remains seated for 3 full seconds while the watchers try to determine if she will respond, will cry, will stand and confront him. She does none of these things. She rises instead with the fluid precision of someone whose muscles know how to move through crisis, and she kneels down to gather the scattered papers, the letters, the broken plastic container. Her face reveals nothing. Her hands do not shake. She collects each piece methodically, her movements economical and controlled, and a resident watching from the doorway, a surgeon named Holloway who once did a rotation with the Marines, understands suddenly that he is looking at someone whose composure comes from a different species of experience than most people possess. She knows how to make herself small. She knows how to absorb humiliation without flinching. She knows how to survive spaces where people with power are trying to drive her out. After the cafeteria is cleaned and the remainder of her break is consumed by documentation work, Laura returns to room for 47 at 3:14 p.m. to do the final check before the shift change. Morrison is sleeping, his breathing steady, the ventilator, if he needed one, absent because his respiratory function had recovered sufficiently to be deemed safe weeks ago. She checks his foresight again, adjusts his blanket with hands that have performed these actions thousands of times across thousands of patients, and her eyes fall once more on the tattoo. The letters remain unchanged. Laura Bennett, rendered in permanent ink on his arm, a memorial to a woman he does not remember saving him. She could speak to him. She could identify herself. She could let him know that the woman whose name he wears on his skin is standing 3 feet away. She does not do any of these things. Instead, she finishes her check, makes her notes in his chart, and walks out of the room toward the supply closet at the end of the corridor. The supply closet is a small space lined with shelves holding dressings and saline and sterile equipment, a space where nurses retreat when they need exactly 5 minutes alone. She opens the metal door and steps inside, and she reaches for the small bag she keeps hidden in the back corner, the bag that contains the items that do not fit into the life she is currently living. Her hands pull out the left combat boot, the one marked with Ramadi dust, and she stares at it in the overhead light of the closet, the leather creasing in her grip exactly as it did 1,000 nights in a dormitory on a military base where everyone was trained to disappear into their assignments. Her hands are steady. Her breathing is steady. But her eyes hold something that would have alarmed anyone who knew how to read the language of people breaking quietly instead of breaking loudly, and she stands in the supply closet at 3:27 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, holding a boot that represents everything she sacrificed to become a ghost, and waits for the moment when being invisible stops being an advantage and starts being a wound that will never heal unless someone knows her name. The supply closet door closed with a whisper, and Laura Bennett stood alone with her breathing and her boots. The fluorescent strip light above hummed with the particular frequency of institutional indifference, casting everything in the color of exhaustion. She didn't open her locker again. Instead, she pressed her palm against the cold metal door, held it there for exactly 4 seconds, then released it and walked back into the corridor as if the break had simply been a pause between tasks, nothing more, nothing less. By the end of that shift, word had reached the 4th floor that Dr. Caldwell was asking questions about her employment history. Not casual questions. Deliberate ones. The kind that suggested someone had decided her presence needed verification, authentication, proof of legitimacy. Laura heard it from one of the younger nurses, a whisper in the medication room about how Caldwell had pulled the hospital's personnel records, how he'd been on the phone with HR, how he kept saying something didn't add up. What didn't add up was that her credentials were spotless. Flawless, in fact, because naval intelligence had spent 18 months building them, constructing an entire professional identity layer by layer, the way you'd assemble a ship in a bottle. Every license was legitimate. Every certification real. Every reference would hold up to scrutiny because the people behind those references were actual people, actual supervisors, actual institutions that existed in a parallel universe where Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett had simply lived a different life. A life where she'd worked at St. Luke's in Portland, then at Mercy General in Seattle, then finally moved to San Diego for the assignment at Seattle General. All verifiable. All traceable. All carefully constructed to withstand exactly the kind of background investigation that Dr. Caldwell was now initiating. What he didn't understand was that the more he pulled on the thread, the tighter the knot would hold. But there was a difference between a cover that would survive institutional scrutiny and a cover that would survive focused, personal, malicious scrutiny, the kind where someone wasn't just checking boxes but actively hunting for inconsistencies, for seams, for the moment when the story breaks. Caldwell had resources. He had institutional access. He had the kind of colleague networks that existed in the upper reaches of hospital administration, the boards and committees where men with surnames like his spoke to other men with surnames like his, where a phone call could ripple through systems faster than any official investigation. The next morning, Dr. Caldwell stood at the nursing station during rounds, loud enough for 6 staff members to hear, "I'll be betting anyone here $20 that Nurse Bennett quits within a week. She's got that look, you know? The ones who think they know better than physicians." He smiled at his own observation, the kind of smile that belonged in a locker room, not a hospital corridor. "What do you say, Bennett? Think you can handle real medicine, or are you going back to whatever community college program you crawled out of?" Laura continued charting. Her pen didn't pause. Her jaw tightened fractionally, so small that no one watching could have named the emotion behind it. Discipline. 18 years of military discipline doesn't evaporate when you're wearing civilian scrubs. When you're undercover. When the patient you're protecting can't remember your face and the man in front of you is testing exactly how far he can push before something breaks. Morrison's jugular venous pressure is elevated, she said, her voice like water, like nothing, like air passing through a hallway. His post-op orders don't include cardiac monitoring. I recommend we escalate to telemetry. Caldwell stepped closer. The residents held their breath. This was territory they recognized, the moment when a junior staff member made a suggestion that challenged the attending, and the attending decided whether to dismiss or demolish. Caldwell's hands moved to his hips, and his voice took on the particular tone of a man who believed his certainty was a weapon. I recommend you stick to bedpans and let me handle the thinking. You're not the physician here, and I don't appreciate being second-guessed by someone who probably got their RN from an online course. Laura met his eyes with perfect calm. Not deference. Not submission. Just calm. The kind of composure that comes from having made life-and-death decisions in the rubble of collapsed buildings, where hesitation means bodies in the sand and speed means coming home. She closed her chart and stood. Yes, doctor. That afternoon, the cafeteria hummed with the organized chaos of shift change, trays clattering, conversations layered one atop another, the smell of institutional beef stew and overcooked vegetables creating a kind of sensory white noise that made it easy to disappear into the crowd. Laura carried her tray past Caldwell's table when his foot extended, just slightly, into her path. The tray crashed. Soup exploded across the tile like blood. Rolls scattered. The entire cafeteria paused for half a second, that micro-moment when violence hasn't quite registered as violence, when everyone's brain is still processing cause and effect. Caldwell stood with theatrical concern. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Here, let me help." He reached down, seized her clipboard, and knocked it against the edge of the table. Medical charts spiraled to the floor, scattering across the wet tile in a paper confetti of patient data and notes. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of someone who discovered that the institution would protect him. "Looks like someone's having a difficult day." Laura knelt without a word. Her hands were perfectly steady. The fluorescent lights overhead cast her in sharp relief, a woman on her knees, gathering papers, while 30 pairs of eyes watched. She could feel them watching. She'd felt watching eyes in Ramadi too, from windows and rooftops and the darkness beyond the perimeter, and she'd learned long ago that if you don't give the watching eyes what they expect, fear, anger, tears, they lose interest. They move on. They find someone else to hunt. Her breathing remained even. Her jaw remained unclenched. When one of the papers stuck to the wet floor, she peeled it gently, carefully, as if it were something valuable instead of something ruined. One of the younger nurses, Thompson, the one who'd mentioned the HR investigation, started to stand, clearly preparing to help, but Caldwell waved her back down. "No, no. Nurse Bennett can handle her own messes. That's what we do here at Seattle General, isn't it? We handle our responsibilities." The voice change would come later. The commanding tone. The moment when Laura Bennett stopped being invisible and started being undeniable. But in this moment, kneeling on wet tile in a cafeteria full of witnesses, she gave him nothing. Not anger. Not shame. Not even acknowledgement. Just steady hands and a face like carved stone, gathering papers, accepting the role he'd assigned her, waiting for the moment when playing the role would transform into something else entirely. By evening, the damage had begun to accelerate. Laura learned it secondhand, the way you learn most institutional knives, through a friend of a friend, through whispered conversations in hallways where people thought she couldn't hear, through the careful way her colleagues suddenly became less comfortable standing near her. Dr. Caldwell had filed a formal complaint with the California Board of Registered Nursing, citing her suspicious lack of verifiable employment history and requesting an investigation into her credentials. He demanded they verify her prior work experience, cross-reference her licenses, and confirm whether she'd actually worked at the institutions listed on her resume. What they didn't know, what Caldwell didn't know, was that on the other end of that investigation were people who could answer their questions. Real people. Institutional representatives who'd been briefed months ago about a potential inquiry. Naval intelligence doesn't plant an operative in a hospital without preparing the soil, without creating the entire ecosystem that would support her if it came under inspection. But an inspection takes time. And Caldwell wasn't interested in time. He was interested in speed. That night, he made the phone calls. 3 of them, to board members he'd cultivated over 23 years at Seattle General. Laura didn't hear them directly, but she heard their effects rippling backward through the hospital like shrapnel from an explosion that hadn't happened yet. The first call went to Dr. Raymond Hayes, who sat on both the Hospital Credentialing Committee and the San Diego County Medical Society. The second went to board member Patricia Wolcott, who'd contributed to Caldwell's research projects and whose daughter he'd treated pro bono when she suffered a skiing accident in Aspen. The third went to Administrator Richard Chen, whose career depended on the hospital's internal harmony and the absence of complaints that made their way to state oversight. In each call, Caldwell's voice carried the particular certainty of a man who'd never experienced consequences for his certainties. "I have significant concerns about an RN on our 4th floor. Her employment history doesn't match her credentials. I suspect she may be operating under false documentation. And more concerning, she's been attempting to override my clinical decisions, even suggesting that she knows better than I do about patient care. She performed a procedure on one of my post-op patients without authorization. I think there's a real question about whether she's actually qualified to be working here." The facts were selective. The framing was perfect. By the time Laura clocked out at 11 that night, 3 separate investigations had been initiated, one through the Board of Nursing, one through the hospital's internal credentialing committee, and one through the state's medical licensing office. None of them would take months. The wheels were already turning, and Caldwell had positioned himself perfectly as the concerned physician raising legitimate questions about a potentially dangerous staff member. Laura drove home through the dark San Diego streets, her hand steady on the wheel at 10 and 2, her breathing measured, her face reflecting nothing in the rearview mirror. She'd been in the military long enough to recognize when the walls were closing. When an operation that had felt controllable was beginning to spiral into something larger and faster than any single person could manage. Naval intelligence had given her 18 months to identify the compromised staff member, to determine whether Morrison's IED attack had been an inside job, to protect him from whatever threat had been significant enough to require a Master Chief's presence in a civilian hospital. She'd had 12 months left. Now she had something closer to 12 hours before the first investigator's call came through, before the questions started multiplying, before every step of her fabricated history came under a microscope held by people who didn't know they were looking for something that didn't exist. Because the real Laura Bennett couldn't be verified through civilian institutions. The real Laura Bennett belonged to classified units, to operations that didn't appear on official records, to a world where her survival required that no one know exactly where she'd been or what she'd done. And the moment someone looked too closely at what she was supposed to have been, a nurse who'd worked quietly in Portland and Seattle and San Diego, they would find inconsistencies. Not in the documents, which were flawless, but in the architecture of the entire lie. The supply closet would be empty tomorrow. The cafeteria would have someone else to laugh at by next week. And whatever Caldwell had set in motion with his 3 phone calls would continue rolling forward like an avalanche, indifferent to whether the person it buried was guilty of anything except refusing to let him cut corners on a patient's post-op care. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in room 447, James Morrison was still lying there with her name tattooed on his arm and no memory of who'd put it there. And now, with every investigation that launched, with every question that led to another question, Laura was becoming less able to protect him from whatever threat had brought her to Seattle General in the first place. The closer she came to being exposed, the farther she was from being able to save him. She sat in her apartment, sparse, empty, the kind of place a ghost would rent, and watched her phone. It would ring soon. She knew exactly what she would say when it did. She knew exactly what she would have to do. But first, she had one more shift. 24 hours left in the invisibility that had been protecting her. One last chance to identify the person on staff who'd been accessing Morrison's records, who'd been asking about what he witnessed in Ramadi, who'd decided that his fragmented memories of an IED attack were dangerous enough to require a permanent solution. She stood at her window, looking out at the San Diego skyline, and waited for morning. The code blue alarm screamed through the 4th floor at 3:47 in the morning. 3 short bursts. Room 447. Laura's hands moved before her brain registered the words, muscle memory from 18 years of hearing that particular frequency in every nightmare and waking moment since she'd learned her name was tattooed on a dying man's forearm. She was moving before the second announcement finished. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The night shift was skeleton crew, 1 resident doing rounds, an intern restocking a medication cart, 2 nurses charting in the break room. None of them ran. Laura ran. The corridor between the nursing station and Morrison's room was exactly 38 feet. She'd measured it during her first week. She covered that distance in under 6 seconds, her body moving with the terrifying fluid precision of muscle memory that predated this hospital, this life, this identity. The kind of precision that only comes from having moved the same way through rubble and smoke while something much heavier than paperwork was on the line. She hit the door frame shoulder first and didn't break stride. Morrison's room flooded into her perception in layers. The monitor displaying an irregular rhythm. The BP cuff showing 72/40 and dropping. The distended jugular veins that shouldn't exist in a man lying flat on his back. The muffled heart sounds that meant the pericardium, the sac around his heart, was filling with blood. Cardiac tamponade. His heart was being crushed from the outside while his body's own emergency response trapped the blood with nowhere to escape. The 2 residents who'd arrived first were frozen 3 feet from the bed, their hands hovering uselessly like they were trying to land jets they'd never trained to pilot. One of them was Dr. Chen, an internal medicine resident with excellent reflexes and absolutely no cardiac surgery experience. The other was someone newer, still learning which end of the stethoscope went in the ears. Laura didn't acknowledge them. She moved to the crash cart and was already pulling gloves from the box before anyone could tell her to step back. The smell of antiseptic and something else, something metallic underneath, flooded her nostrils. Blood. His blood. Not from an external wound. From inside. Get me a 14-gauge needle. 20 milliliter syringe. Now. Her voice came out flat. Clinical. The voice of someone who had performed this exact procedure in a bombed-out medical clinic in Fallujah with mortar fire splintering through the walls and a Marine whose name she'd never forget hemorrhaging into his own chest cavity. The voice of someone who knew that the window between saving a life and attending a funeral was approximately 4 minutes wide. Dr. Chen moved. Something in Laura's tone had cut through his paralysis like a blade through silk. The syringe appeared in her hand. The needle. She'd already prepped Morrison's chest, found the landmarks by touch alone, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The spot where a needle could pass through the chest wall and into the pericardial space without shredding a lung. "What are you doing?" Dr. Chen's voice cracked slightly. "Dr. Caldwell is." "Here's what you're going to do," Laura said. "Not a question. Not a request. An order. You're going to run an EKG if he's not already on it. You're going to get 2 units of O negative up from blood bank. You're going to call the OR and tell them we're prepping for an emergency thoracotomy. Do that. Now." The needle went in with the kind of smooth precision that comes from having done something 217 times before. The pericardium had its own texture, the needle parted it like membrane, and then there was resistance. Then the sudden give that meant she was through. 30 milliliters of dark blood filled the syringe. The color of old pennies. The color of time running out. With each milliliter she withdrew, the monitor's muffled beeping grew sharper. The sound started tracking back toward something resembling life. The O2 sat climbed. 68. 72. 78. 84. The numbers climbing like a child's hands gripping the rope in a game of tug-of-war. She withdrew 60 milliliters total. 60. The amount of blood that had been slowly crushing the strongest muscle in his body into arrest. "BP coming up," the intern said. His voice wavering. 92/56. Heart rate. Laura hadn't moved from the bedside. The needle was out. The moment of immediate danger had passed. The moment between one breath and the next when a man's life tips from impossible to possible. 118. Sinus rhythm. Sinus rhythm. The intern sounded like he was praying. The door opened. Dr. Caldwell entered, still wearing yesterday's cologne and the expression of a man who'd been summoned from home for something that better be worth the drive. His eyes tracked the scene in exactly 1 second, the open crash cart, the blood-filled syringe on the tray, Morrison's color already improving, the numbers on the monitor stabilizing into something resembling a rhythm that matched human life. Then his eyes found Laura. She was still wearing her gloves. She was still standing exactly where the procedure had been performed. She was still the only person in the room who hadn't moved since the alarm sounded. "Step away from the patient," Caldwell said. Laura stepped away from the patient. "Who authorized this procedure?" His voice had taken on the quality of someone who'd just watched his own authority walk out the door and climb into an ambulance. "This is a pericardiocentesis. This requires physician oversight. This is invasive cardiology. Tamponade with acute hemodynamic collapse," Laura said. Her voice remained flat. "Clinical. The voice of someone reporting on weather. Needle decompression in an emergency situation is a protocol extension in acute cardiac care when physician supervision is unavailable. The patient was in arrest. He would be deceased in 3.2 minutes without intervention. You don't have standing to make that call." But his face was already shifting. The color draining. Because he understood exactly what she'd done. She'd saved the life. She'd done it without waiting. And he'd arrived to find a patient who should have been dead, breathing steadily instead. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. 60 milliliters of blood drained. Sinus rhythm restored. Patient stable. Laura peeled off her gloves one finger at a time, the latex making a small sound as it stripped away. "What would you like me to do next, doctor?" She knew the answer. She could read it in the way his hands had clenched. In the way his jaw had shifted. In the way he was already thinking 3 moves ahead, already calculating how to transform this moment from a life saved into a liability he could weaponize. By 7 that morning, 3 phone calls had been made. The first to board member Harrison, who controlled the hospital's credentials committee. The second to board member Walsh, who sat on the quality and safety committee. The third to the state nursing board's investigation line. By 7:15, Laura had been informed that she was suspended pending investigation. By 7:30, her badge had been deactivated. She'd stood in the administrator's office, a room that smelled like expensive coffee and new carpet, and listened to the words without changing her expression. Reckless procedure. Suspicious background. Gaps in employment history. Liability exposure. The administrator kept waiting for her to cry. She didn't cry. She'd asked where to return her equipment and walked out. The locker room was empty. She gathered her personal items in under 4 minutes, a photograph of a unit she'd never served in publicly, a phone charger, the copy of a nursing manual she'd picked up her first week to establish credibility. At the bottom, wrapped in an old t-shirt, were the combat boots. She stared at them for longer than the task required. By evening, she'd returned to Seattle General using a maintenance entrance she'd identified during her first week. The kind of entrance that nobody watched very carefully. The kind of entrance that people without badges still used regularly. She made her way through the basement corridor, past the electrical room, past the stored equipment, past the place where the old respirators were kept, and entered the laundry facility at 8:43 p.m. The industrial washers hummed their mechanical rhythm. The dryer spun. The air was warm and damp and smelled like bleach and something else. Something clean. Something temporary. Her scrubs were in the return bin. Seattle General Blue. 2 sets. She'd folded them carefully that morning, never knowing they'd be her last. Now she unfolded them and refolded them one final time. Each crease exact. Each corner 90 degrees. The way a Master Chief Petty Officer folds anything when the world has taken everything else. This was the final indignity, returning the uniform that had been her armor. The disguise that had let her stay close to Morrison. The identity that had let her save his life this morning while destroying her own. The name tag came off cleanly. She placed it in the small bin for damaged equipment. Seattle General wouldn't reuse it. Morrison would wake up tomorrow and ask about the woman with the steady hands. And nobody would have an answer. The person who'd saved his life wouldn't be there anymore. and whoever had wanted him silenced was still walking around this hospital, still breathing the same air he breathed, still knowing exactly what he'd witnessed in Ramadi that was dangerous enough to require an inside job, an IED, a paralysis, and now, if Caldwell's plan worked, an unprotected target with no one watching his back. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Caldwell's face darkened the moment he understood what had happened. Not confusion. Recognition. Laura had performed an advanced cardiology procedure, a pericardiocentesis, the kind of invasive intervention that belonged in a cardiologist's hands, not a nurse's, and she'd done it without waiting for authorization, without calling him first, without the chain of command that kept surgeons like him insulated from liability. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. She'd saved Morrison's life and made him look incompetent in front of 2 residents and a room full of nursing staff who'd watched her do in 90 seconds what he would have ordered done in 15 minutes. The trembling wasn't fear on Caldwell's face. It was rage. By 0600 hours, he was making phone calls from his office with the door closed, his voice measured and professional, each word calculated to poison without leaving fingerprints. 3 calls. 3 board members. The first to Harrison Pierce, the hospital's chief financial officer. We have a serious credentialing issue. A nurse performed invasive cardiology on a high-risk patient without physician oversight. It's a liability nightmare. I'm concerned about what else she's been doing without authorization. The second to Dr. Margot Sterling, the chief medical officer. I need to formally report a protocol violation. The Bennett nurse in 447 performed an unauthorized pericardiocentesis. I'm worried about her background. Something doesn't add up. Her employment history has gaps, references that are hard to verify. I think we need the state board involved immediately. The third to James Bancroft, the board chairman himself. I wouldn't normally involve you directly, but this affects patient safety at the highest level. We have an unlicensed practitioner performing advanced procedures. If something goes wrong, if she punctures the wrong vessel next time, Seattle General could face criminal charges, not just civil liability. Each sentence was technically true. Each omission was deliberate. Laura had performed the procedure correctly. The patient had lived. The authorization issue was a technicality that existed only in the architecture of hospital hierarchy, in the invisible power structures that kept surgeons at the top of the food chain. But Caldwell didn't frame it that way. He framed it as recklessness. Incompetence. A threat. By 0800 hours, Caldwell had personally initiated an emergency investigation request with the State Nursing Board, citing Laura's suspicious lack of verifiable employment history and pattern of unauthorized medical interventions. He included fabricated details, dates she'd supposedly worked without proper documentation, procedures he claimed she'd performed in the past that he had no evidence of. The paperwork was thorough, official, the kind of filing that triggered mandatory inquiries, the kind that meant the state board would now begin requesting records, verifying credentials, digging into the background of a woman who had no background to dig into because her entire nursing career was a fictional construct maintained by naval intelligence. Caldwell had weaponized the system itself. He'd taken the institutional apparatus, the protocols, the regulations, the bureaucratic machinery designed to protect patients, and turned it into a weapon. It was elegant, really. He didn't need to fire her himself. He just needed to make sure the right people asked the right questions, and the system would do the rest. By noon, the first response came from the state board, an official notice that Laura Bennett's nursing license was under investigation pending verification of her credentials. By 1400 hours, Human Resources received a notification that her badge access needed to be suspended pending the outcome of the inquiry. By 1700 hours, the hospital's legal department had drafted her termination paperwork, citing unauthorized advanced procedures and failure to adhere to chain-of-command protocols, language that made her sound dangerous rather than heroic, reckless rather than skilled. No one asked Morrison how he felt about the procedure that had saved his life. No one mentioned that the young residents in room for 47 had watched a master clinician work under pressure with a steady hand that came from somewhere beyond nursing school. No one noted that his oxygen saturation had climbed from 68 to 94% in the time it took Caldwell to walk from his office to the ICU. The narrative had already been written. Laura wasn't a hero. She was a problem that needed solving. By evening, she sat in the HR office while a woman with kind eyes and an apologetic tone explained that the hospital had no choice, that the state board's concern about her credentials had triggered mandatory suspension, that the investigation would need to run its course. The woman slid a folder across the desk, official termination paperwork, the letterhead of Seattle General Hospital, her name printed in the legal font that made everything official and irreversible. Unauthorized procedures. Failure to follow protocol. The language was designed to justify what was actually a crucifixion. Laura didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. She'd known this was coming from the moment Caldwell's face changed in room 447. She'd understood the physics of institutional power, that one surgeon, positioned correctly, with allies in the right places, could collapse a cover story faster than Morrison's heart could fail. She simply signed the paperwork, acknowledged the effective date of her termination, and stood when the woman in HR indicated the meeting was over. "Your badge will be deactivated at 1800 hours, the woman said softly. "You'll need to return any hospital property." Laura nodded, and walked out of the office with the composure of someone who'd been dismissed from far worse situations than a civilian hospital. She returned to the locker room at 1830 hours, her shift officially over, her access about to expire. The space was empty, most of the nursing staff was on the floor, tending to patients who no longer had her name on their chart. She opened her locker, the metal door hanging on a hinge that squeaked, revealing the contents of her cover life. Scrubs in 3 colors, arranged in military order. A pair of clogs she'd worn twice. And at the bottom, wrapped in a hospital towel, the pair of worn combat boots that had carried her through Ramadi, that had been present when she'd found Morrison bleeding out in a bombed-out structure, that bore the scars of running through sand and rubble and death. She pulled out the boots. The leather was cracked from desert heat and rain. The soles were worn thin, she'd probably gotten another year of use out of them before they'd be unusable. She turned them in her hands, the weight of them familiar in a way that 19 months of nursing scrubs could never be. These boots remembered things her brain had learned to compartmentalize. Every scar on the leather was a mission, a close call, a moment of survival. The laces were frayed. The heels were worn at an angle from her gait, the particular way she distributed her weight through her body, a pattern that had developed over 18 years of carrying weapons, ammunition, and sometimes other human beings through terrain that didn't want any of them to survive. She placed them in her personal bag, along with a nursing school pin that wasn't real, and a photograph of a person she'd pretended to be, the civilian Rachel Morgan who'd worked at 3 different hospitals before arriving at Seattle General, all of them fictional entries in a database that naval intelligence had spent months building. At midnight, she stood alone in the hospital laundry room, folding her scrubs with the same precision she'd applied to everything else in this life. The fabric was still warm from the dryer, and the smell of industrial detergent filled the small space, a smell she'd come to associate with 18 months of pretending to be someone ordinary. She folded each set into precise rectangles, the seams aligned, the cuffs matched. It was muscle memory. The military didn't just teach you how to fight. It taught you how to do everything with intention, how to fold a shirt so the wrinkles aligned in straight lines, how to organize chaos so thoroughly that you could function in the worst circumstances. She placed the folded scrubs in a laundry basket marked for hospital donation. They weren't hers anymore. Nothing in this hospital was hers anymore. Her cover was fractured. Her mission was compromised. Morrison was still unprotected, and somewhere in this building, someone who'd wanted him silenced badly enough to plan his death was still walking through these corridors, still unknown, still free. The laundry room hummed with the white noise of industrial machines. Somewhere above her, Morrison lay in room 447, probably awake, probably confused about why the steady voice that had pulled him back from the edge of cardiac arrest had disappeared from his room. Somewhere on another floor, Caldwell was sleeping the peaceful sleep of a man who'd successfully eliminated a threat to his position. And she stood alone, folding scrubs at midnight, watching the end of a 19-month operation collapse like a building with its support beams cut through. Naval intelligence would extract her within 48 hours. They'd already be making calls, activating protocols, arranging for the documentation of her fake employment history to be quietly erased from whatever databases Caldwell's State Board investigation had targeted. They'd probably reassign her to another hospital in another city, give her a new name, a new background story, and send her back out to do this again somewhere else. But for tonight, in this laundry room with its warm scrubs and industrial detergent, she was no one. Not Laura Bennett, the Master Chief Petty Officer. Not Rachel Morgan, the ordinary nurse. Just a woman in civilian clothes, holding a job she no longer had. The trembling wasn't fear. The military had taught her that trembling was a choice, and she'd made a different choice a long time ago. But standing in that laundry room at midnight, with a mission crashing around her and Morrison alone upstairs with a killer still unidentified, she understood that there were limits to what compartmentalization could contain. There were things that didn't stay neatly folded. There were moments when the silence was too loud, when the weight of inaction was heavier than any load you'd carried through Ramadi. She took the folded scrubs to the donation bin. Then she left the laundry room, her combat boots in her personal bag, everything else abandoned. And that was when her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number, the kind that naval intelligence used for operations going sideways. Stay available. Something's happening. She had no idea what was about to change everything. The morning news broadcast flickered across the hospital lobby television as the day shift arrived, casting blue light across the marble floor like water. Laura's military portrait filled the screen, dress whites, every ribbon aligned, her jaw set with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The Chiron crawled across the bottom in bold capital letters, decorated Master Chief Petty Officer missing after investigation into Navy cover-up. The overnight security guard, a former Marine whose name tag read Clayton, looked up from his desk. His eyes found the photograph. Found the call sign printed below the name. He didn't blink. Just reached for his radio. "Lighthouse," he whispered. The word hung in the air like a salute. 2 Army nurses passing through the lobby stopped cold. One of them grabbed Clayton's arm. "Did you just say?" "Lighthouse," he confirmed. "That's Lighthouse." Dr. Caldwell emerged from the elevator at 7:56 a.m., his white coat crisp, his gold watch catching the overhead fluorescence the way everything always bent around him: light, rules, expectations. He was already composing the speech he'd deliver at the board meeting, already planning which administrator to call first, already tasting the victory of finally removing the problem nurse from his department. He stepped into the lobby and froze. The hospital administrator stood before the television with her arms crossed. The lead state investigator from the credentials probe stood beside her, holding a tablet. Security had formed a perimeter around the entrance. And every person in the lobby was staring at the screen where Laura Bennett's rank materialized like a sentence being read aloud: a Master Chief Petty Officer. 3 Navy Crosses. 2 Bronze Stars. Silver Star for carrying 4 men to safety under heavy fire in Ramadi, one of them named James Morrison. The administrator's voice carried across the marble. "Dr. Caldwell, we need you to come with us." A 4-star general appeared on the broadcast, reading from a classified brief with the authority of someone who didn't have to raise his voice to be heard. Master Chief Bennett was conducting undercover investigation into systemic malpractice affecting veteran patients at multiple medical facilities, the general stated. Her cover was maintained to protect an ongoing probe into compromised care protocols and staff members who may have been involved in deliberate harm to military personnel. Caldwell's face drained of color. The tablet the investigator was holding displayed 17 surgical cases. 17. Patient names. Dates. Complications that should have been reported and weren't. Post-operative cardiac monitoring deliberately omitted from orders, every single one with his signature. "We discovered these during the audit triggered by your investigation into her credentials," the state investigator said quietly. "Funny how that works, isn't it? You pulled her file looking for fraud. We found fraud. Just not hers." Someone's phone was streaming the live press conference. The voice that came through the speaker made heads turn throughout the lobby. It was Morrison. Corporeal James Morrison, calling in from his hospital room, his voice steady despite the months of rehabilitation, the confusion, the stolen memories. "I don't remember her," Morrison was saying to the camera. "I don't remember Ramadi. I don't remember the woman who carried me 3 miles with a collapsed lung so I could live. But my body remembers. When she did that procedure, the needle thing, the pericardiocentesis, my body remembered her voice. My heart remembered. And I knew she was saving my life. Again." He raised his forearm. The tattoo was visible even through the camera quality, Bennett, in capital letters, the ink faded by time but unmistakable. "I got her name tattooed so I'd never forget," Morrison said, and his voice cracked like he was holding back something enormous. "And then the brain injury took even that. Took the memory, took the understanding, took everything except the mark on my skin. But she remembered. She's been here the whole time, protecting me. She's been here protecting all of us." The lobby had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. The state investigator turned back to Caldwell. 17 cases, doctor. For patients developed cardiac tamponade after your post-operative orders. 3 of those patients are dead. We're reviewing another 42 cases where you've marked procedures as complete when hospital records show they were omitted entirely. The investigator's voice was the sound of a door slamming. "We're going to need you to come downtown and answer some questions." Caldwell tried to speak. Nothing came out. Nurses began whispering. Connecting dots. Remembering conversations they'd had with him, concerns they'd raised about patient protocols that he'd dismissed, safety suggestions he'd called inefficiency, shortcuts he'd defended as modern surgical practice. One nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd worked with him for 8 years, stepped forward. "The Jacobson case," she said clearly. "I told you his cardiac monitor should stay on post-op. You said it was unnecessary." He coded 3 hours later. Another nurse stepped forward. "Chen. Post-operative day 2, you ordered no central line monitoring. He went into septic shock." A third voice. "Morrison wasn't supposed to be his only patient in recovery. You cut ICU monitoring time. You did it on purpose." The lead investigator began reading from the tablet, each case a sentence, each sentence a nail. Falsified completion reports on 47 procedures. Medicare fraud totaling $847,000 in unnecessary billing reductions. Negligent homicide charges pending on 3 separate cases. Hospital legal counsel emerged from the administrative office. The chief medical officer appeared from the back corridor. The hospital administrator's expression had shifted from angry to something colder, professional detachment. "Your privileges are suspended effective immediately," she said. "The board is recommending your medical license be revoked pending criminal investigation." Caldwell reached for his phone. The administrator held out her hand. "The board members have been informed. They're cooperating with investigators. The calls you made yesterday morning requesting their support? Those calls are Exhibits A through C in the obstruction of justice investigation. Your own words, Doctor. On recorded lines." His own weapon turned perfectly against him. They didn't arrest him right there in the lobby, that would have been too much. Instead, security escorted him to a conference room where more investigators waited. A prosecutor from the San Diego DA's office. The medical board's legal representative. And the evidence. Files and files of evidence. His own work. His own orders. His own signature on every single falsified report. By noon, local news stations were running the story from every angle. Decorated Navy Master Chief exposed for saving veteran's life. Surgeon's malpractice uncovered during investigation into whistleblower nurse. Hospital's efficiency metrics masked systemic patient endangerment. The headlines kept multiplying like cells dividing. Caldwell spent the afternoon in that conference room watching his career dissolve with the clinical precision of a timed chemistry reaction. The medical board representative explained that his license suspension would become permanent. The prosecutor outlined the charges he was facing. The investigator showed him the list of hospitals nationwide where similar patterns had been detected, all of them triggered by the probe Laura had initiated. 17 hospitals. 43 surgeons under investigation. Over 200 patients affected. He had tried to destroy her. And in doing so, he had destroyed himself, and in destroying himself, he had exposed a network of medical malpractice that stretched across the country like a constellation of failures finally visible to the naked eye. By evening, Seattle General's administrator had already issued a statement: "We are implementing immediate corrective measures to ensure patient safety protocols are never again compromised by efficiency metrics. All surgical cases reviewed by Dr. Caldwell in the past 7 years will be audited. Families of affected patients are being contacted." That evening, Laura was in her apartment, small, sparse, military clean, when her phone rang. The number came back as Seattle General Hospital. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "Master Chief." Morrison's voice. Clearer than it had been in months. Stronger. "They told me who you are. They told me what you did in Ramadi, and what you've been doing here. I don't remember it, but thank you. For everything." The stoic mask finally cracked. Just for a moment. In private. Where no one was watching. The tears she hadn't allowed in the supply closet or the laundry room finally fell, and Laura let them, because some forms of composure are just another word for surviving alone, and sometimes the only way to truly carry someone to safety is to let them carry you back. 6 months later, the Navy Memorial in Washington gleamed under sunlight so bright it looked like the air itself was polished. Laura stood in dress whites, every ribbon and decoration aligned with military precision. The Distinguished Service Medal hung from its ribbon, waiting. The Secretary of Defense approached with the citation, and his voice carried across the gathered crowd: 200 military personnel, veterans, investigators, journalists, hospital administrators, and nurses who had driven from Seattle General to be there. For exceptional valor in combat operations and extraordinary service protecting American veterans through undercover investigation that exposed systematic malpractice and criminal negligence, the Secretary read. Master Chief Bennett's dedication to the oath she swore, to leave no one behind, extended far beyond the battlefield and into the halls of healing. Her sacrifice and her courage have already changed how we protect those who have sacrificed for us. Morrison sat beside the podium in his wheelchair, wearing his own dress uniform. The Laura Bennett tattoo was visible on his forearm, faded by time but permanent. On his wheelchair footrest rested a single worn combat boot, the left one from her locker, its partner finally reunited after 18 months apart. The leather was cracked, the sole worn thin from miles of desert and duty. But it was whole again. The pair was finally complete. Someone spotted Dr. Caldwell 3,000 miles away, teaching CPR fundamentals at a community college in San Diego for minimum wage, his medical license permanently revoked. He stood before disinterested students demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy, his hands moving through the motions with the mechanical precision of someone who had been stripped of everything that once made him matter. He was nobody now. Just a man teaching beginners how to save lives, the opposite of what he'd done for 8 years. Laura approached the microphone. The crowd quieted. She looked at Morrison, at the boot on his wheelchair, at the gathered faces of service members and veterans who had come because they understood that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding it all together. True class, she said, her voice steady and level, is what you do when the lights go out. When no one is watching. When there's no rank or recognition, just the person in front of you who needs help. Morrison raised his hand in salute, precise, perfect, formal. She returned it with equal precision. The crowd rose as one, 200 people standing, applauding, honoring not just the medal but the sacrifice that had earned it. The kind of sacrifice that doesn't ask for recognition, doesn't seek reward, just shows up and does what needs doing because that's what warriors do, military or medical, uniformed or in scrubs. The applause echoed through the memorial like distant rotor blades. And somewhere in that sound was every person Laura had ever saved, and every person she'd protected, and every person who would live better because she had stood in the darkness and refused to bend. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, If you've ever had to hide who you really are to protect what matters, then Laura's story is for you. Subscribe for more stories of hidden strength, quiet courage, and the extraordinary people among us who change the world when no one's watching. Like this video if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. Comment below, what would you have done in Laura's position? Drop your thoughts. And if you know a healthcare hero in your life, share this with them. They deserve to know that their sacrifice matters.